Okay, let's get started. Good evening and welcome to MIT. My name's Eric Adams and I'm one of the members of the John Freeman Committee. The Freeman Committee is part of BSCES, Boston Society of Civil Engineering subsection of ASCE, and we're responsible for putting on the Freeman Lecture on an annual basis. In a moment, I'll turn the mic over to Rishabh Iyer, who is the current chair of the Environment, Water Resources Institute of BSCE, and he'll tell us a little bit about the water activities in that agency. Our lecture is named after John Freeman, who many of you know was a graduate of MIT, civil engineering back in the late 80s. He became a renowned engineer worldwide, actually. Locally, he was responsible for the design of the original Charles River Dam that's next to the Science Museum. And nationally, he was involved in the water supply systems for cities such as New York City and San Francisco. Funds for this lecture come from a gift that he made to the Society back in 1925. And one of the stipulations was that it was supposed to be used to further the education of young hydraulic and water resource engineers. And it's our hope in this committee that tonight's lecture, past lectures, and hopefully future lectures will help convey to the young professionals the excitement of the water side of CE profession. So maybe Rashid, if you come on up. Okay. He has a few words about activities on the water side of BSCE.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rishabh Iyer. I am the chair for the Boston Society of Civil Engineers Environmental Water Resource Institute. On behalf of the Society, I would like to thank our speakers and everyone here in attendance. The Boston Society of Civil Engineering, a section of ASCE, otherwise known as BSCS, fosters professional development of its 3,400 members and their organization by offering diverse technical lectures, in various disciplines of civil engineering, legislative advocacy, public outreach, and awards and scholarships. Our efforts to help our members advance in their careers and maintain a competitive edge in the global economy, and all this is made possible through the efforts of the member volunteers who are active partners on our 9 technical groups, government affairs, outreach committee, and liaisons to the student chapters. I strongly encourage everyone here to visit the website and find out how you may become an active member of BSCS. I would be remiss if I would not thank the generous society and the program sponsors. Without their support, BSCS would not be able to undertake the wide variety of technical events we conduct each year. Our main sponsors here are AECOM, GEI, Keller Stantec, and then our program sponsors include Alfred Benesch Company, Beta, BSC Group, CDM, Collins Engineering, Dewberry, Green Environmental Affiliates, GZA, Geo Environmental, Haley and Aldridge, Horson Whitley Group, Howard Stein Hudson, Hoyle Tanner Associates, HNTB, Kleinfelder, English Engineering, Department of Civil Engineering, Civil and Environmental Engineering at Northeastern, Patrick Engineering, Simpson, SGH, Scanza, USA, Tying Bond, Trans Systems, Treveyos, Tufts University, Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, VHB, and WSP. Again, I encourage everyone to visit the website at bscs.org and see our listings for upcoming events.
Okay, thank you. So our lecture tonight is in the honor of the late Professor Peter S. Eagleson. and will be given by three of his closest colleagues professionally, starting with Brendan Harley from CDM Smith, Dara Antakabi from MIT, and Raphael Bras from Georgia Tech, in that order, spanning more or less the chronological career of Peter Eagleson. Collectively, they'll spend about 60 minutes in making a presentation, followed by 30 minutes or so of question and answers. And following that, there's a little bit of dessert that should be left outside. You guys can pick it up on your way back. So we'll start off with Dr. Brendan Harley, who is a senior vice president at CDM Smith. He did his undergrad work and master's work at University College Cork, Ireland, and he got his PhD in 1971 at MIT. Since graduating from MIT, he's spent upwards of 50 years with CDM Smith and its earlier incarnations, and has worked on a lot of very interesting projects, probably the most well-known one being the Marina Barrage project in Singapore, which he gave one of the Freeman lectures 15 years ago. When he was a graduate student, maybe his last year or perhaps his first year after having graduated, he taught hydrology at MIT, and I think he was the first to teach it with a textbook called Dynamic Hydrology, which was written by Peter Eagleson. So Brendan.
Just on this keyboard here, page up, page down. Do I? It's page down. Okay. Let me get through to my one. Yeah. We're just going around in circles. Let me pick. All right. Are we supposed to look on this or this one?
This one, hold on a sec. Sorry about that. Which one's your share, Harley, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then to change it.
Then go to.
Right, but the changes page down.
Yeah. So it'll show up as you do.
Right. Okay. Obviously, the joys of modern technology and old eyes who can't see this. Good evening. I'm Brendan Harley. I'm probably the earliest of the group here who worked with Pete back in starting in the late 60s. And I'm going to give you a quick summary of the work we did back then. It is distinctly different from later phases in his career, but he was the foundation of a lot of the work we did. Let me talk about the evolution of hydrology in the 60s. Back then, we had a lot of classical procedures, empirical procedures, which really hadn't evolved much in the previous quarter century. Most of the solutions for hydrologic problems were complex mathematical functions, and we looked up the solution in handbooks. Some of the early work in computerization was actually just to mechanize, if you like, the solution to those equations, but that was very much a blind alley. And at the time, a number of people were beginning to look at linear hydrology systems that could be done. I started work in that area back in about 64, 65. So that's just the basis. We were coming truly from an age where things weren't very systematic at all. I joined Pete in the Hydro Lab in 1967. He was in the process of writing his book, Dynamic Hydrology, and he had just begun to shift from his hydrodynamic career, I guess, in the lab to this new field. Interestingly enough, the group was based in Building 1. We were physically separate from the wet work in the Hydro Lab. At that time, it was the Hydro Lab, now the Parsons Lab. We worked in conjunction with equally young and innovative groups in structural engineering, geotechnical, transportation, all of whom were beginning to learn how to apply computers of the size and scale of IBM 360s, 370s to their individual problems. There was a lot of shared ideas and work together. And that was part of the beauty of the work in those days. And by the way, for most of you who probably don't remember an era where all we had was slide rules, we didn't have electronic little desk calculators, certainly no minis or maxes. We had log tables and slide rules. So the idea of working on a big computer was quite different. Now, what Pete brought to the table was really to go back and start from first principles and look at what hydrology was all about. At the time, there was quite a complex watershed model known as the Stanford watershed model, which had everything you could think about in hydrology built into it. Had about 50 or 60 parameters, nearly all of which were black box parameters, and you had no clue what they meant. You could calibrate it, but you had no idea how to change them as you move forward. What Pete was doing was saying, let's go back to fundamentals. Can we break down a catchment into what I'm showing here on the right, which interestingly enough is a copy of one of the earliest slides, transparencies, that Walter Grayman and myself put together in the fall of '67, as Pete was convincing us we should break catchments down into simple blocks like this. Looks simple now, back then it was quite innovative. And then say for each one of these components, we can compute how they will perform under different conditions and with measurable parameters. So if the watershed changes, I know what to change. If I urbanize a watershed, yeah, I can tweak the numbers and I know why I'm doing it. That was the big difference that Pete made and brought into the system. We also found that modeling the network as a network was a key component in reproducing the behavior of a system, not just the whole block, but the network as a whole. And the other thing we found through various experiments is one model won't solve all the questions you have, won't solve all the equations. Things have gotten a little better with some of the newer codes, but I still think there is a tendency to use a sledgehammer to solve everything. What Pete was very much a proponent of back then was find the right tool for the right job. This will probably give you a laugh. This was the group of students working at MIT. This is a picture from the 1970s. But it's interesting to look at how multinational the group was. MIT had a big intra-American program, but we see there my colleagues, all of whom were struggling day and night to get programs to work on that damn computer, which of course was on the other side of the campus by Vassar Street. So we had to bring our card decks there and walk over backwards and forwards with our results. Pete was sort of the orchestra master. We had a lot of support from Frank Perkins, John Shockey, and Ron McLaughlin, who helped with the underlying codes. And a few of the students and how they contributed. I was working on urban catchments. Walter Grayman was doing rainfall characteristics, and that's where we learned that moving storms and the abilities to simulate storms was actually quite critical. There's no such thing as a static 100-year storm or 25-year storm. Depends how the storm moves. All of that stuff was built into the codes. Dan Gunaratnam from Malaysia, who was one of my connections then to Singapore and later at work. Willie Vicens, who is here tonight, was working on rainfall simulation work and later flood control work. Dick Laramie did flood routing. Eric Wood, Juan Valdez, and Ignacio Rodriguez were also peripherally involved in these groups, and they had stellar academic careers later. And then finally, we had a young student called Rafael Bras, who was looking for something to do one semester. And I had the fortune that he did a thesis for me, and we got him into urban hydrology, and the hydrologic profession should be glad of that. So it's a small world at times. The interesting thing about those days is these tools started to be developed in 68, 69. By 70 or 71, actually, the profession was trying to use them. It was a very rapid rollout of these computer models. There was a huge demand for them. And it was an example of work being done at MIT that was really rolling out into the profession very, very quickly. It was research at the time, but it was very practical research. part of my evolution in my career is we set up a small consulting firm up the road near Harvard Square, which actually acted as an incubator for a lot of these tools to be applied to government and private clients. And many of the folks who are still active in hydrology and hydrologic modeling ran through that pipeline for quite a few years. And that firm finally became part of Kempthorne McKee Smith. But it was an interesting example of research work. Once Pete cracked the code, and once we helped him crack the code, that break the system down into small components and become good at evaluating it, they really changed the whole approach to hydrology. And I have a list here of some of the codes that many of you use probably still from day to day: SWIM and STORM, HEC codes where we help write some of the solvers, EPA net that emerged much later, WAMO, Pete Shanahan will remember that one, DynFlow, they all emerged from that group that Pete fostered in those years. I want to show you an example here. This was Singapore in probably late 78, early 79. We got a question from a remote part of the world. Could you actually collect direct runoff from some of their new towns that they were building in the jungle? Each of these new towns was about 250,000 people. Could you capture the rainfall runoff from that? And they get about 100 inches of rain a year, very flashy floods. Store it in reservoirs you'd create in the urban environment and actually use it for drinking water. In fact, treat it inside. The conventional wisdom was held no. We systematically applied a bunch of the codes, and the answer was very definitely yes. You could balance this. You had to do some interesting design work. But that project was designed and was in operation by 1985. And since then has provided up to 30 million gallons a day of the highest quality drinking water from urban development. That was an example of how fast these tools were rolled out. The other interesting project, I'm just going to take a few minutes. Eric mentioned it, is Marina Barrage, which was probably the most well-known of the projects that evolved from this group. It actually was originally conceived in about 1985 when we were looking at flood management issues in Singapore. And in fact, when I went over to do the initial Bidoxolatar scheme, they'd had a serious flood event the year before. In December 78, they got 550 millimeters of rain in 24 hours, 22, 23 inches of rain. It flooded the heck out of a whole lot of the island. So they asked me, well, if you're going to do this drainage scheme, could you tackle this flooding problem? And being crazy, we said yes. And that actually was the first application in a large scale of MidCat to a real world serious problem. One of the things that came out of this is let's build a dam, which sounded good at the time. Now it evolved very quickly over the next 15 years into be a truly multi-purpose project. And I'm mentioning this one because it is the kind of project you're going to need for climate adaptation, climate change. This is built about 1 kilometer offshore from the old shoreline. All of the land you see on each side of it here is filled land. But what it encloses is what used to be the port of Singapore. Everything inland from this was an active port. It is now a freshwater reservoir since the scheme became operational in 2008 and fully operational in 2010. And it is truly a multi-purpose building that serves, it's kind of like Freeman's work here on the Charles River, except on a scale that's a lot bigger. And you might say that's a tremendous investment, and yes, it is, but it needs vision and insight, and it needs a hydrologist. The other thing is it gets about 1 million people a year visiting it, and it has spawned several $1 billion worth of development along the shoreline of it. So hydrologists can play a significant role in the development of areas, and this is some examples of what goes on there day in and day out right now. No one of us ever expected to have projects like that. The graph on the upper side shows the subcatchments, which we had to go through manually, break down by hand, simulated. And the interesting thing is between 85 and the final design, which was about 2005, very little changed in the runoff estimates. The original models still stood up fine. And by the way, all of the flooding in those upstream areas has been solved. The other thing for places like Boston is if you build an offshore facility like this, you can protect an entire shoreline of a city. That project protects all of the those blue areas of Singapore Port and associated areas, which are relatively low-lying, and the total project cost about $200 million. That's peanuts. Everyone thinks it's big, but with the right area and the right tools, you can go there. So that's some of the fun of being a hydrologist, and that's mostly for the younger folks here. There was an interesting article, and I will leave this to you and you can read it online. This was written by someone I don't know, who basically said, hey, I can play around on the roof of a barrage on a Sunday afternoon. And this single piece of infrastructure does a remarkable number of things. One piece, but designed by the hydrologist to do flood control, water supply, stabilize the basin inland from it, and improve water quality. Now, all of that is due to Pete. He didn't have his fingers in each one of these, but the fundamental training and the tools we developed in that short period in 67 to 71 or 72 was the fundamental of all of this work. Now, he then became head of department for a while, and he came back, and he then turned his attention on really expanding hydrologic science. So I was tasked with just discussing some of these early days and keep it reasonably short, and Raphael and Dara will deal with the evolution of it. But it was his leadership and the skills he taught us and the competency that we developed in those days in MIT and the ability to analyze a problem and use the right codes, that we owe him a great debt of gratitude. And I have to remember, he also was a tremendous fan of the Red Sox and baseball, and never asked Pete a question if he was listening to a Red Sox game on the radio. I made that mistake once in the fall of '67 and never made it again. That was one of those infamous things. Harley, you said what? Now, a few closing points, and this again is addressed to those of you who are looking at hydrology or hydrologic engineering as a career. Hydrology is sometimes viewed as a science. There's a very essential aspect of it, which is looking at the fundamental ecohydrology and ecosciences. There's the hydrologic engineering end of it, which is really critical in these days of climate adaptation and stuff we have to do. And I define it in my way as a hydrologist more than anyone else has to see and evaluate the climate change, get a sense, use your codes, figure out what's going to go on, and help move forward, because we have to invest, and we have to invest now. The predictions for climate change are all over the map. They're still evolving. They're getting worse most of the time, but society can't wait. Singapore was an example of someone who stepped forward because in some ways they had to, although the flooding they had downtown back then is no worse than the flooding we get down the Seaport District these days. That was what triggered them into action. Policymakers around here can get frozen with indecision. Paralysis by analysis, I guess is the term we use. You never have the absolute right solution. As an example, Hong Kong was a city that suffered from that for many years. They could never get the perfect solution, so they got no solution. Singapore brought a whole different sense, and many agencies are more like Singapore. Incrementally, they will get there. So I just want to nudge people who are interested in a career that hydrologists can play an essential role in this. You will find yourself as someone who has to bring it all together and adaptable. And that thing on the left is a picture of me working with some urban planners in Singapore and early visions of the scheme and how the city could develop. So thank you very quickly. I tried to keep this short, but now you're going to see the later phases of Pete's career. But the fundamental engineering capabilities he taught us are incredibly valuable to the profession. And thank you, Pete.
Okay, our next speaker will be Professor Dara Antakabi. He is the Bacardi and Stockholm Water Foundation Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering and Earth and Planetary Sciences at MIT. He got his undergraduate and master's training at nearby Clark College and Clark University. in 1983 and 84, then his PhD from MIT, working with Pete Eagleson in 1990. He is well known for his research on land-atmosphere interactions. He's won a number of awards for that work, and he is the science team leader of NASA's Soil Moisture Active Passive Satellite mission. He has taught hydrology at MIT for several decades now, and I think in the early phases, he also used Pete's book, Dynamic Hydrology. Tara?
I just got a text that the screen is not shared, so I may have to do it from here. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so I think someone from the AV needs to come down. Sorry about that. Hi, I just got a text that the screen is not being shared in Zoom. Okay, can you fix that, please?
It is being shared.
Or,
I can show you the screen share.
okay.
It is. You just need to launch your presentation.
Back. Okay. I see it on the screen here, but not up there. Oh, there we are. Okay. Let me find the laser pointer too. Try to point in the right direction. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm gonna talk about some of the contributions of Pete Eagleson following what Brendan summarized as his early career in developing hydrologic science and from hydrologic engineering. And basically 3 topics. I'll try to be quick about each of them. They're each vast topics. The first one is scientific hydrology and the book that Brendan mentioned, Dynamic Hydrology, that came in print in 1970. And then Ecohydrology in a series of papers that I'm going to cover, the sort of well-known series of 7 papers in one issue of Water Resource Research, as well as a few follow-on papers on the general topic of ecohydrology. And then later in his career, the topic of global hydrology. So I'm going to walk through each one of these, but just to mention that each one of these is now a standing discipline. There's entire journals basically on each one of these, with some of them with the exact same title. And in the American Geophysical Union, which is home to a lot of the work that Pete did, he was the president of AGU, there's standing committees on each one of these. So these things have become disciplines in and of themselves. So let's, and also one thing I want to mention is that those middle block, the series of 7 papers, Climate, Soil, and Vegetation, Pete gave a Freeman lecture, same venue, in the mid-70s on, after he finished those papers, was, I think, a 3-day Freeman lecture. And it was traditionally, I think at the time, the summary of Freeman lectures were published in ASCE journal. So what he presented in 1978 were debuted as a Freeman lecture. So let me go to the first topic, which is the book Dynamic Hydrology. It was published in 1970. And to just get a baseline, the context for, was this truly a departure from what was in print at the time as textbooks of hydrology? We were kind of fortunate that this was in the middle of the International Hydrologic Decade by UNESCO. And as part of the hydrologic decade, very timely in 1970, no less, they published a report called Textbooks on Hydrology. So we have an exact snapshot of what was then prevalent hydrology textbooks around. It's a very comprehensive book. It's not only in English, but English, French, Spanish, Russian, and other German and other languages. So this is just one page out of that book. And it's the one page that was, and for a decade or so later, still the dominant English textbook in hydrology. And I certainly was exposed to this. And the chapter headings, how many pages, and what are the latest references in this book. So the traditional outline of precipitation, stream flow, evaporation, hydrographs, routing, and risk analysis, frequency analysis. Again, very traditional, but look at the reference dates. They're all decades old. Basically, the field was, in a sense, in a static mode at the time. Then came this book, Dynamic Hydrology, in 1970 by Pete Eagleson. And this book was reprinted in 2003 by the European Geophysical Union. And Pete has a preface to it. And it gives the history of how this book came about. So it's very, in his words, what he says is that Arthur Ippen, who was the founder of the Parsons Lab and Pete's advisor, when he also became a faculty, his mentor and employer, he said Arthur Ippen had said that hydrology was ripe for application of science as well as engineering, and that he gave Pete, this is a second quote, he gave Pete a teaching sabbatical. He allowed him not to teach for a year in order to work on this book. And what Pete did was go across the street to electrical engineering, and he took a lot of courses from people like Fred Schweppe and others in linear systems, as well as probability from across the sea, Alvin Drake, the three giants of the field. And then he realized that he wanted to blend in some geoscience. So he went to the meteorology department at the time, now EAPS, and took courses in ocean science, atmospheric science, and really brought those into the sort of geophysical fluid dynamics and weather and climate into the fold. So we sort of fast forward to towards the end of Pete's career. He was awarded the MIT Killian Lecture Award, which is the highest faculty designated award at MIT. And in it, he says that, so he sort of summarized what he wanted to do with this book and his career, which is to incorporate large-scale geophysical interactions that involve hydrology into the discipline, and also mature the topic of land surface atmosphere feedbacks. Ocean atmosphere feedbacks, as we'll see in a second, were prevalent at the time. And it sort of bring hydrologic science as a sister geoscience in study of Earth systems. So with that, I think dynamic hydrology established year zero of hydrologic science, given the context of what the discipline was and what dynamic hydrology included. Let me go to this series of papers. Again, a remarkable thing, which was 7 papers in one issue of dynamic hydrology. The common title is Climate, Soil, and Vegetation. And each one of these papers is, deals with a different topic. I think a lot of people sort of regard this as a Talmudic text. The more you read it, the more there is to learn from it. There's no really end. And the objectives that he set for these papers he wrote is first of all, retention of the underlying physical mechanism. That's key. And also look at where uncertainty can be encapsulated and represented through the application of applied probability. So those were the two things that he wanted to keep. And those were defined two goals for this series of 7 papers. He wanted to explain the partitioning of precipitation among the components of the surface water balance without resorting to empiricism and model tuning or model calibration. So the problem basically is this graph, the conceptual graph in the paper, from the paper, is that if you have annual precipitation varying on this axis, the quantities of the surface water balance are on this axis. Obviously, precipitation forms a one-to-one line, but how it partitions into infiltration, groundwater runoff, evapotranspiration, surface runoff are these lines. Can you predict those without resorting to empiricism? That was goal number 1. Goal number 2 was to explain the interannual variability of water balance components that's principally forced by the stochasticity of precipitation. So here's annual precipitation normalized by its mean value, just to have a dimensionless quantity. And this is the probability or recurrence interval. And the solid, the symbols are your plotting position based upon observations. So he sort of set to work on defining a one-dimensional water balance with soil moisture and fluxes in and out and a subsurface. And the key insight that he brought to the problem was that hydrology goes through different regimes. It's a series of transition of regimes. And that happens with storms and interstorms. That during a storm, this is an exaggerated sort of picture of what a storm and interstorm looks like from the paper. Soil moisture goes up and the storm ends, you go into an interstorm period and soil moisture depletes among the components. It goes through different regimes during the storms and during the interstorms. That's the sort of the key enabling component. So what he brought together was retain the physics, remember his words, and deal with uncertainty in sort of with this insight. So the first step is to conceptualize the arrival of storms and interstorms as a stochastic process. So these are storms of different duration and intensity, and then a random time between storms. So he conceptualized the arrival of storms as equal probability in every unit time. So it's a Poisson process in terms of stochastic representation. Time between storms is by necessity an exponential distribution for a Poisson process. Storm durations are exponential, he conceptualized, and storm intensities are exponential. So this is a representation of the stochastic rainfall process. What that allows you to do is to deal with the stochasticity of weather and climate without resorting to, for instance, plotting positions and the need for long records. So for instance, he derived, based upon those 3 constitutive probability distributions, the probability of mean annual rainfall from just 5 years of looking at storm durations and intensities. And he is able to reconstruct the distribution that you would get with those plotting positions. So again, this is looking at interannual variability by building it from the ground up. So again, you have storms and interstorms associated with this stochasticity. Back to the physics. We have the advection diffusion equation for the time and space evolution of soil moisture in one dimension. And we have closure relationships for the physics, the hydraulics, soil hydraulics. So the retention curve, the permeability curve, the diffusivity equations. This particular model is due to Norman Brooks, who was Pete's host just before he published a series of papers at Caltech. That's where he developed it. So when he went to Caltech, Brooks was working on these equations and doing experiments for characterizing capillary storage in porous media. And what Pete did was in the third of his series of papers, look at solutions to the advection diffusion equation with Norman Brooks's closure relationships. So he had sorptivity of water into the soil during storms and desorptivity of water back to evaporation during the interstorm. And with those Norman Brooks equations, he developed the physical relationships that are needed for these two solutions. Notice that both of them, as the advection diffusion equations, go down as 1 over the square root of time. So during an interstorm or a storm, those functions go down as the 1 over the square root of time. And now he put the stochasticity and the physics back together. During the storm, the infiltration rate is going down as 1 over the square root of time. And during interstorm is going down as the square root of time. And if this is the rectangular pulse of storm, then at the early stage until at a certain time, the water absorbs all the precipitation. But then as the square root of time catches up with you, you have to have infiltration excess. So for each storm, stochastic storm, he can figure out what these are. Sometimes you don't have the two regime change. Sometimes you don't even have runoff. But stochastically, you can deal with them. Same thing for the interstorm. You have the early phase where evaporation is limited by available energy, so potential evaporation. Square root of time catches up with you again, and then you become water limited. Rate limiting is the soil moisture diffusion. So with those two equations and the stochasticity for time between storms and storm depth, he has 3 areas of integration over the probability density functions. Region A, for instance, in infiltration, where surface retention, energy limited, water limited evaporations, and so forth. And with it, he comes up with an expression for how much evaporation can take place, all non-dimensional units. And this is the full solution that he has based on that. Same thing for runoff. The solution is this, which he later said that Chang Mei was quite a bit of help in finding us analytic solutions. So this is the full the partitioning that I talked about for annual water balance between precipitation, runoff, and evaporation. And let me go back. It has 2 sort of parameters that are difficult. One is the vegetation fraction M, and dimensionless and KV, which is the transpiration efficiency. Now, one could regard those normally as free parameters that you have to sort of fit to a location, but Pete had other ideas. He said, what if we hypothesize that natural vegetation systems develop a canopy density M that produces the minimum stress, meaning maximum soil moisture? So he was able to take those free parameters and, based upon his water balance, come up with a hypothesis on ecological adaptation that gets rid of that parameter as a free parameter. So this is the formal definition. You maximize the evaporation function with respect to canopy density. And as a result, we go back to this figure. He's able to use soil physics to come up with the infiltration-exfiltration relationships and how they vary in time and switch regimes depending on the forcing, precipitation, and potential evaporation, and then construct, based upon probability distributions, the interannual variability, which are these lines that match, this is the yield of a basin, the observations if you had enough years of data to do the plotting positions. What the closure function allowed him to do is, instead of saying these are fitting parameters, he plotted suboptimal values, meaning just take some values, and then plot the optimal values. And the optimal values are get rid of that unknown equation. Very briefly, that's sort of the second part. Another thing that he did is in 1986, he published a paper called The Emergence of Global Hydrology. And the context is that this was in the middle of the Togo core period, which was when oceanographers and ocean scientists and atmospheric scientists, meteorologists, came up with a research plan, more so than an experiment, to solve the problem of the two fluids at the same time. So as a result, they were able to get these emergent phenomena like El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is neither in the ocean nor in the atmosphere. It's a result of the coupling of the two. So Pete Eagleson thought that there's also not just ocean and atmosphere, but land and atmosphere, which have a lot of these emergent properties, which has become a sort of a whole discipline of research. And really, the agenda put forth in this paper is year zero of global hydrology or land-atmosphere interaction. The last piece is he, in the early 80s and into the early 90s, he went back and looked at the issue of the evolution of soil, vegetation, and climate, much more so from a sort of a ecohydrology or adaptation point of view. And he had two hypotheses that he worked on. One, that vegetation evolved to maximize biomass productivity and minimize water stress at the same time. So with his equations, he can actually use them to show this. And second, even more ambitious, is that vegetation induces in soil structure that makes the hydraulic property of the soil that allow minimum canopy stress, meaning that the soil and the vegetation also co-evolve, but on much larger timescales. So the first statement is that you have a soil stress minimum for a given canopy, and they would graphically look something like this in the soil moisture M vegetation fraction space. So one application of it is to savanna systems where you have trees, grasses, and bare soil coexisting. Why do different savanna systems have particular mixtures of these three? Why doesn't one completely take over? So he used his solution to the water balance equation, analytic solution here, and there's three unknowns. The soil moisture, fraction of the woody vegetation, and the fraction of the grasses. And the fraction bare soil is 1 minus the sum of those two. So he defines a series of dimensionless variables, and the water balance equation becomes simply this. It looks simple, but it's actually embedded in it is a lot of relationships. But that's one equation and three unknowns. The second hypothesis he put forward is that the tree, which has deep roots, will not grow roots beyond which it can basically stop our percolation, loss to groundwater. There's no reason to grow roots and waste energy on growing roots if you're going to not be able to drag water out of it. And if it's too shallow, it loses water to the groundwater, which is a waste of productivity. So that's one second relationship. And the third relationship is what we've seen before. So now we have three equations, three unknowns. And if you plot the solution to this, gives you a fraction of the, for instance, the woody vegetation as a function of some mixture of climate and soil variables. And at the time, he had 2 points of observations to put on this graph. And today, with satellites, we can populate this graph to no end. I mean, just at 3 kilometer scale, 2 kilometer scale globally. It's really work left undone. And in this field of ecohydrology, and Raphael's going to talk about this more, after he retired, he wrote 2 books on ecohydrology, just continuing on this topic. And really, this was yet another year zero. It was year zero of ecohydrology as a discipline. So 3 entirely different disciplines, all thriving disciplines. Each of them had their year zero with something that Pete, in a very imaginative and non-derivative way, introduced to the discipline. On a personal note, I should say I came across dynamic hydrology in the stacks of WPI, Paul. When I was at college, I decided to study hydrology, but it was a liberal arts college, and there wasn't any courses particularly there. So I basically read everything, every book I could get my hands on, and went through all the books that, were probably listed in UNESCO's compilation. Until at WPI stacks, I came across dynamic hydrology. And it was really a sort of a week in the knees moment where you have to sit down and absorb what you've seen. And I called Pete and applied to work with him. I sat with him, and he asked me a few questions on day 1. How much probability do you know? And I said what I knew, and he says, you should take undergraduate probability. How much fluid mechanics do you know? You should take undergraduate fluid mechanics, and better yet, TA for me. And so basically started from scratch. And he said, we should meet weekly to make sure you're on track. And I said, it's fine, but I'm not much of a morning person, so anytime in the afternoon, Thursday, Friday, it's fine. He said, how about Mondays at 8 in the morning? And so it was throughout my career. And really, he left us a template. He imagined the mountain where, to this day, we leave pebbles on top of one another, trying to get to them. And it was really a mentor, a father that I had just lost, and a guiding light throughout his career. And one thing also that we did quite a bit was discuss politics, culture, everything, more so than we did hydrology. And I think one thing he really did to a lot of his students is that to be creative and sustain a career in this discipline, you have to be an intellectual more so than just a disciplinary specialist. So it's a great influence, and again, like I mentioned, much work left to be done in what he left.
Well, thank you. Our last presentation will be by Professor Raphael Bras, the K. Harrison Brown Family Chair, Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and Professor of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Georgia Tech, where he has spent the latter part of his career, including a stint as provost and an executive vice president for academic affairs. But the majority of his career was at MIT. He was a triple beaver, having gotten his 3rd degree, that being a PhD or SCD, in 1974. He then joined the faculty and spent over 30 years doing research and teaching, and also directing the Parsons Lab being the department head for the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department and the chair of the MIT faculty. Raphael.
Well, good evening, everybody. You hear me well? Let me begin by saying it's always wonderful to be back here. As Eric stated, I spent over half of my life in here. He described it, I'm a triple beaver. I used to call it a lifer. But basically, I didn't think I would ever leave this place, but I did. But it's always good to be back. Let me begin by saying the following. When I was, my career has been wonderful. And part of the reason it's been wonderful is that I've had I was part of a family, which was the Parsons Lab at the time. I always said that the one job I always wanted to have was the director of the Parsons Lab. And it was a wonderful and my first administrative job. And I had three mentors that helped me throughout my career. I had Don Harleman, who I would describe as the kind, loving father. Then I had Ignacio Rodriguez Iturbe, that was like the older brother. Then I had Pete, who was like the stern father, which I think Dara captured very well. And then I even had a problematic younger brother, and that was Dara. I actually remember like yesterday when Darren Tekabe showed up asking for admission, and I talked to Pete and said, what is this guy doing here? He's from Clark Liberal Arts Geography. But he proved us all very wrong. But indeed, it was a wonderful, wonderful family. My role in here is to talk a little bit about Pete's role in creating hydrologic sciences. And that, I think you've seen the evolution as Dara, starting with Brendan, which by the way, is guilty for me getting into hydrology. Otherwise, I would have no idea of what hydrology is. We weren't from Brendan, and it was almost one of those accidents of life. Thank you, Brendan. It worked. But there was a sense at the time that as important as hydrology is to engineering, and it's indeed very, very important, that it needed a place among the geophysical sciences. This is a quote of an editorial that Pete and I wrote. It says, because the pervasive role of water in the affairs of man, the development of hydrologic science has followed rather than led the applications, primary water supply and hazard reduction under the leadership of agricultural engineers. But it is time to recognize that the basic research on hydrology should have an explicit home in science and in engineering, and to prepare a national plan for the development of that crucial science. So there was a mandate in there, or sort of a desire to the community to say, all right, we've done great, it's very important in the hydrologic sciences, but we need to become part of a larger community of the geophysical sciences. Pete undoubtedly, and there's nobody, some people can argue this or that, but Pete really and truly, in essence, defined what that is. And what we all do now, or by we, I include people like Dara and me for sure. Late in the 80s, after the paper on global hydrology that Dara discussed, he promoted the idea of creating a committee that will put hydrologic sciences on the map. And the National Research Council of the National Academy of Sciences was convinced through the Water Science and Technology Board created a committee. Those are the members of the committee, an interesting group of people. Many of you may know some, many of them are still around, including presently a Nobel Prize winner, Sikuro Manabe, which was one of the first individuals to work in global models of climate. Pete was a chair of that, and he spent innumerable amount of time trying to formulate this committee and taking care of the politics and making sure that all the different areas and institutions were properly represented and that there will be no duplication. Out of that effort that took on the order of 2 years, in 1990, what we call the Blue Book came out. And the Blue Book is Opportunities in the Hydrologic Sciences. And I would describe it as this is the foundational constitution of what hydrologic sciences came about. And what I'm going to try to do for the next few minutes for you is talk of what was stated in that book and what came from that book. And even preparing for this, I was amazed at the impact that it had and how much of what was said there has become a reality. The book, some of the key elements, it had more than that, but I chose those 5. First, define what the hydrologic sciences are. Number 2, stated a series of unsolved problems. Number 3, define what some of the data needs were. Number 4, talk a little bit about education and how hydrologic, education in hydrology should evolve. And number 5, gave a series of resources and strategies to achieve, that were resources that were needed and strategies to follow to achieve those goals. So let me begin by addressing each of those one at a time. On the definition of hydrologic sciences, the key idea of that book is that the hydrologic sciences was not the hydrologic cycle in the river basin, but we have to think of it in a global sense, with water in all its forms and in all its realizations. So we're talking about a cycle that encompasses the atmosphere, the ocean sciences, and the solid earth. And it's in a way a combination of a series of existing sciences, but we have to think of it in that complicated fashion. In the way, this is another expression out of the Blue Book, where, as you can see, connects the hydrologic cycle all the way to the core of the earth. So all the activity that occurs all the way from space down to the core of the earth. And he argued that to understand maybe a little bit more understandable hydrologic cycle at the global scale, to understand the idea in this era of climate change and global change science, that we have ice caps that capture, where most of the fresh water is stored, that if those melt, things will happen, that the atmosphere has really a very little amount of content of the water, but it's incredibly active, and understanding what goes on and that interaction with the land, that to do that, you have to look at it systematically, and you have to look at it in that way, at that interaction of all the oceans and the solid earth and the atmosphere and the fluxes between the land and the atmosphere. That, I think, was a key idea that came out of this and incredibly important. I remember very, very clearly, there was, when I was taking as an undergraduate at the time that I met Brendan, hydrology. And I'm not going to mention the name because it's a very, very well-known geophysicist. But he came to our class of hydrology here at MIT and made the following statement. He said, look, I hate to tell you, but hydrology is irrelevant to the climate of the earth. The climate of the earth is controlled by the ocean. Anything else is irrelevant. quite shocking. At least for me it was. Well, I think opportunities in hydrologic sciences and the work that follow has proved that wrong. There's no doubt that the oceans are a very dominant component of our climate. But at the same time, there is no doubt that what happens on the surface of the Earth is incredibly important to understand the climate system. And that came out of this idea of looking globally at what I would call the hydrologic cycle at the level of a system that is effectively global and beyond. Let's talk a little bit about some of the unsolved problems they talk about. One was the representation of flow-through fracture media. A lot of work has been done on that topic since then, and a lot of significant accomplishments. So from that period of the mid-80s to now, a significant amount of representations of flow-through fracture media have developed that are way beyond what was being seen at the time. Another one was hydrology and landform, the evolution of landscapes. This is, again, from the book. This is actually a work of one of my students, of how hydrologic processes impact the morphology, the erosion, the formation of basins, and they themselves affect the hydrologic process. So there is an iterative, a closed cycle of cause and effect. So the input is affected by the outcome, right? So as you organize the basin, that basin erodes differently. And as you erode differently, you change the hydrologic processes, including the formation of soil, the mixing of soil, et cetera, et cetera. So again, that was a problem. Incredible amount of work. This type of model, which was novel at the time, is pretty much, I won't call it run of the mill, but pretty well established and used and accepted. This is the work of Randy Custer, if I recall correctly, which look at, well, what happens for a drop of water that evaporates from the Sudan, where it shows up. The idea that there's a scale where the disturbances at different parts of the world show up in other parts of the world, that the very dynamic atmosphere interacts with that hydrology in different locations and locales. That again was inconceivable. Now is par for the course. There's no question about impacts of El Niño and La Niña in rainfall in Colombia or South America or in the Midwest of the United States, for example, or that evaporation from large irrigation areas in the Midwest impact downstream precipitation. All those things are pretty well established at the moment. At this point, they were not. These were questions that were asked, and in my opinion, were answered. Driven. It was sort of the formula, the guide that we all used to say, what is an important problem when the students came about, and I did that plenty of times, and I'm sure many of you have, and say, what should I work on? As I here, read this. Pick anything out of that and go for it, all right? And the end result has been an incredible amount of extraordinary amount of work. Dara referred to the idea of an ecological optimum, and I'm going to get back to it. The relationship between living systems and physical hydrology and the atmosphere and the soil. That interaction between the ecosystems and the hydrology, the water system, the hydrosphere, and the biosphere. And Pete proposed what now maybe, and it's not fully accepted everywhere, but what ecologists at the time would basically say, this is anathema, this is heresy, this is crazy. You're out of your mind. I'm not exaggerating. Those words were used. In stating that these systems over long times influenced and impacted each other and modified each other so that they created what he called the climax solution, the optimum. Where these systems together arrived to niches that were optimal in some fashion. And that are defined, how could I produce the maximum yield with the least amount of water? And that, to answer that question, I need to have the right amount of soil, the right type of soil also, in the right climate, in the right atmosphere. So that to the ecologists of the moment was crazy, absolutely crazy. Not so crazy nowadays. So he started speaking about, again, how do I get to that optimality conditions? How do I define niches in terms of things like latitude? Again, a lot of work. The whole field of ecohydrology that Dara so well described started with that thinking, and a lot of us are still working in many of those areas, but incredible amount of work. Again, as I said, in preparing this talk, I realized very, very quickly, and I had not pulled out the blue book for a while, that many of these things, so much has happened that it actually looked primitive to me. Now you say, is that bad or good? I think it's fantastic. You know, the fact that from 1990 to now, we basically have, if not solved, pretty much advanced extraordinary to an extraordinary degree, practically every single one of the problems that the Blue Book defined. That is amazing. That is the impact that I think that Pete had. At that period, at the time I was doing mid-cap precursors with Brendan Harley, the limitation to a large extent was data. We were a data-limited science, if you want to call it that way. We needed data to measure fluxes. We didn't quite understood the synergisms of models and data. We were not measuring land cover routinely. Large-scale experiments at the level of continents or on that order were not existent. But again, they stated all these problems. And if you have lived through it the same way I have, and I was there at the beginning working with NASA, and you consider what has happened, it just blows your mind. This is one of the most unsung successes of science and of this country in technology. When the Earth's observing system was first conceptualized around the 1990s, and I recall being in the NASA committees at that point, we were just beginning to touch the idea of, amazing, let's look at the Earth for a change. And what happens? What you have in that figure, that's just a family constellation of satellites that are looking at the Earth. Some of them that have been around for quite a while, you know, Terra, Aqua, are actually coming down, if I understand, anytime soon, and they're being decommissioned. But somewhere in here, the Global Precipitation Mission that follows something called the Tropical Rainfall Measuring Mission, incredible success. I was fortunate enough to work then and still work with them. You know, prior to that, we had no measurements of rainfall over the oceans, except the chance occurrence of a ship going by when it rained. Just think of it. The impact that has on the global energy balance and the global water balance, and we had no idea, no direct measurements. But that was changed with stream and then GPM. And then what I call Dara's baby, SMAP, that measures soil moisture. The concept of measuring the what I would call the controlling valve of the hydrology globally from space was unthought of. It took Dara and many others to start working on that idea. And now that satellite has been flying for 7 years plus and going, and other missions have been put up to do the same thing. For the first time in the history of NASA, there have been missions, including SMAP, and certainly the GPM, the second edition of the Tropical Rainfall Mission, and lately something called SMOS, is this the SWAT, I'm sorry, that are strictly motivated to solve hydrologic problems. That is the proof of the pudding. That's what the Blue Book did, all right, which is quite fantastic. In education, it's maybe the one place where we have failed the most, where we didn't quite achieve everything that the Blue Book called, which called for a really matrix, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach where hydrology will be taught as an independent science. That is happening to some extent and happening in some places, but it hasn't quite advanced as much as some of the other things that I have talked about. Resources and strategies. American Geophysical Union, the AMS. AMS, for example, has probably one of the best hydrology going on these days in the country. American Meteorological Society, the Ecological Society of America, quite successful in increasing the presence of leaders from hydrology in those institutions. NASA, as I said, programs completely dedicated to hydrology. Department of Energy, USGS was always there, but the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy, probably one of the two largest funders of hydrology these days. Who would have thought? Hydrologic sciences journals, maybe we got too successful at that. There are too darn many of them. But there are over 20 credible hydrologic sciences journals. And finally, let me just mention two things. The establishment of a hydrologic sciences program in the National Science Foundation, and that was called explicitly by the Blue Book, and it came directly from that call and to be. And the Blue Book also said, in a few years, it said 5 years, but it took 10, sit down and figure out where we are. And that was done and published. I guess I don't know whether you call it the second generation Blue Book, Challenges and Opportunities in the Hydrologic Sciences. Dara was a member of that committee. So there's no doubt that the Blue Book and Pete Eagleson became the cornerstone, the blueprint for the development of modern hydrologic sciences. No individual contributed more. He was like a bulldog on this issue. He was a promoter, the inspiration, the leader, and the taskmaster. And he was a taskmaster, and that make it possible. So he did this, and many of us would have sort of faded into the horizon, but he didn't. He retired in 1993, 94. And then he decided, well, why don't I write a few other things? So he wrote this incredible book called Ecohydrology. I believe this is one of the first time, if not the first time, that a book has that title. Now, this is not for the faint of heart, to say the least. But what he does in that book is he takes those papers that Dara talked about, puts it all together, and goes a lot more into that interaction between the vegetation and the soil and the atmosphere, and comes out with a solution of how, at that point, at the species level, in other words, can I predict what species will occur where? Okay, that's what that book, if you can get through all the equations, that's what that book gets you to understand. It's really an amazing thing that I don't think anybody has gotten near. And finally, range and richness in bachelor land plants. This one is different because if before he was dealing with monocultures, one species, what he tried to explain in there was not only location of species, but he wanted to explain the diversity of species. And he explained diversity and occurrence of species, imagining a latitudinal zonal model of the Earth, by looking at the variability in radiation, in solar radiation. That's what that book does. But again, he's now looking at the two dimensions, not one species, but what is the variability. So to end, let me say thank you all for listening, and thank you for those that spoke before me, and thank you, Pete, for all you did for us. Thank you so much.
Well, maybe we have a little time for some questions and answers. Perhaps the three speakers can come down. I hope the microphones are working. We'll get a couple questions.
No, we can answer. Any questions? Don't shoot.
Can't see you anyway. Sit down or?
I'll start off with
I prefer to stand.
Dennis.
Dennis? Oh, okay.
Then if you don't mind, I'm going to stand. I have too much energy. You can sit down. Oh, okay. All right. Good enough. All right. Thank you.
Then we can't see anybody.
I don't know if this is the best place to start, but Rafael, I thought you may want to drop the other shoe about hydrology and education, because you were very candid about that part of the Blue Book not really reaching its fruition. But could you comment on why you think that is, and what might be the future now? Is that matrix, for example, still relevant or an ideal, or would you see things evolving somewhat differently?
Well, let me. I'm going to speak as a hydrologist, also as a former university-wide administrator. What has been done then is that the acknowledgement of that is there, and the increasing collaboration of things is there. But having said that, our university systems, the disciplinary structures of our university system is so stiff that it's impossible to change. And some of that is driven in many ways by us. You know, we are the Boston Society of Civil Engineers. That professional anchoring makes very hard the cutting and slicing of established columnar siloed disciplines. I think progress has been made, but certainly has been made here at MIT, and MIT was way ahead in that respect. But I think I'm very honest and candid. That's the one place where the Blue Book was unable to really move the needle too much. It moved it, but not that much.
So rather than hydrology being part of civil engineering, hydrology is on the same plane as geology.
Well, that is true in some places right now. And the other answer that I can give you is it doesn't have to be either or. It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive either. If you think of the way that was structured, Dara and I are members of the School of Science and the School of Engineering. I was here at MIT and at Georgia Tech and in California. I was a professor of both in engineering and in science. By the way, I was going to say, you heard my chair title, the K. Harrison Brown family, but I used to have his chair when I was here. And I liked that one a lot better because it was a rum and water professorship.
Grog.
Well, thank you, folks, for really great presentations. It was very, very wonderful. What I wanted to ask was sort of touches on the questions of how we move forward towards more interdisciplinary efforts, as well as funding. I guess what I was really encouraged to hear, Raphael, you mentioned about DOE and DOD being major funders. Do you think it's possible that that kind of driving force, from the agencies like that will encourage interdisciplinary work more so to sort of break those columns or those, towers of different disciplines? Is that something that we can look forward to? And, what would each of you say about, making that happen, so, for the good of everybody? Thanks.
Dara, you want to take a crack at that first?
Yeah, it's really related to the education and where is the home for hydrology as well. And I agree with Raphael that maybe the vision that was in the Blue Book at 1980s, 1990 of where the education should take place, it hasn't taken place there, but in a sense, it has been a success in other ways, is that if you look at hydrology journals and the affiliations of the authors, it's very much right now prevalent and acceptable that they're in atmospheric science department, they're in the ecology department. So in a sense, hydrology has been exceedingly successful in going into other disciplines that relate to water in one form or another, like ecology or atmospheric science. But in the process of doing that, it has lost its sort of an exclusive home for itself. So in a sense, it's good and bad that we have lost our identity, but permeated in every relevant discipline that there is. And the same thing can be said for the agencies. Right now, all the major agencies include the Department of Energy, besides USGS and NOAA, and NASA is one of the big agencies promoting hydrologic sciences. So the success of permeating elsewhere sometimes comes at the cost of not having an identifiable four walls of a home, which is fine.
I think that you have to consider that, again, when you look at organizations and you study organizations, somehow you have to cut the pie, right? And no matter how you cut it, that sets some walls. They can be less or more permeable, but there are walls. And when you look at the agencies, and the divisions of the agencies, they're all fighting for resources in different ways, shape and form. and hence some are better on having really flexible porous walls and some are less so. So they have the same problem we do in academia in a similar way, which is again a matter of the buckets, where do the resources go in the different buckets, and we haven't figured out a way of how to mix the buckets or have one single big bucket. It's really hard.
Well, I want to thank you very much. It's been a great series of presentations, and I was in Brennan Harley's actually first hydrology course at MIT. So my question is, in these discussions, there hasn't been any talk or too much talk about the impact of human activities on the hydrologic cycle. I mean, we know humans impact the hydrologic cycle by land use change and our use of water. Then also we have this, we have climate change now. And I'm wondering what Pete thought about this. And if in the latter part of his career, he spoke much about impacts of climate change on the hydrologic cycle and the threat that was proposing.
I think, like Brendan mentioned, he thought of sort of the hydrological science supporting the engineering that needs to be done. For example, the work that Raphael showed from evaporation source of the soot fluxes across the globe. That's an engineered systems, and that's why he focused on that particular example. So, and now with the issue of looking at climate change and climate adaptation, the climate change problem from a science point of view is a water problem in a sense, in many ways, both water as a greenhouse gas as well as water being the limiting factor in ecosystems and the carbon flux, the net carbon balance over land. So I think that distinction is that humans are not added to the earth science problem, but they are the agents, principal agents, was always there with Pete, I would say.
Yeah, and one of the points I made in my last slide is the actual global situation is changing extremely rapidly. The science is falling behind in trying to catch up. They are doing incredible work. In the meantime, we're suffering from real flooding, real problems. And there are situations where we can engineer solutions with proper assessment of the hydrology, but in some ways we got to get ahead of this problem. We can't wait for the science. Part of what we need is judgment between, and I will go back to this assessment of hydrology being like geology, geologists. The one characteristic of geologists, if you've worked with them in your professional career, is they never have enough data. They never want to make a decision. And I've had problems in groundwater with geologists and engineers. Engineers' focus is different. I've got a problem to solve. I have enough information to solve it. A geologist always wants to continue studying. Now, that's just the nature of the science, the nature of the training. And I want to make sure that as we train new hydrologists, we train a number that for practical applications, good God, the globe needs you in the next 10 years. We can't wait. Things are changing extremely rapidly. Your job is to assess the research work. You can't wait for the results. Their job is to continue to train people and develop better remote sensing and incredibly better techniques. But it is a bit of a double-edged sword. But in some ways, the rate of climate change, I think, has actually surprised many of us. Like, for example, sea level rise in Boston Harbor. That's at the extreme limits. Sea level rise in my home city of Cork, Ireland, is pushing beyond anything that was forecast for 2050. They're already there, and the engineering solutions are not. So that's part of the challenge. There's plenty of work to be done. And I recognize hydrology as a hydrologic science has improved incredibly from those primitive days that we looked at it. There is hydrologic engineering, and that can continue in parallel.
I think Pete in particular had a very unique definition. I didn't necessarily agree with him in this, but he saw the engineering part as the prediction part. That's what he defined as the engineering part. And the reality is that I do that. Many of us do that, right? We do the science, but we get to predictions quite commonly. For example, I deforest the Amazon, which is a problem I've worked over a long time, and it affects the energy and water fluxes at continental scale. Can I predict what's going to happen? I was having a conversation today with Professor El Tahir. What is going to be the storminess in a climate situation? I can debate that in either direction. And that's where the science comes. But at the end, you have to make a prediction, right? To do something. I was also fortunate to be involved in probably one of the most unique projects for 20 years working in Venice, in building the barriers to protect the city of Venice against flooding. Well, that's based on a sea level rise prediction with whatever we knew then. So the answer is, yeah, we do it. It happens all the time.
So thank you very much again for a very wonderful session. I wish I could bring all of my students, all of my postdocs for all these years over here and just sit down here and listen to you. My question is about—
You can always invite us, Arup.
Huh?
You can always invite us, Arup.
I'll be very happy to. Question is on the— I mean, I have a lot of questions, but I'll just ask one, which is on the point that you mentioned, Rafael. So this is more or less a water hydrology group. So for us to say that water is it, well, it's expected. But it's not just here. The World Economic Forum says that, if you have to solve United Nations SDGs, almost all of them goes through water. Question is, if you think of climate, it has made such a huge impact in the human psyche, if you will, in education especially, and across in research. Why is water, despite all its successes, what needs to be done for it to get there?
What is to be done?
For water to get at the same level of, attention, if you will, from policymakers, citizens, stakeholders, as climate seems to get?
Well, let me answer that in maybe in a simplistic fashion, but I had a conversation about that also today. And that is that as scientists, let me blame the scientist side of me, not necessarily the engineer, but the engineer also has the same problem. We are terrible in articulating the issues in a way that the public not only understands, but cares. The reality is that many times we speak to issues like climate change in some fashion, in a fashion that it sounds so removed and so diffuse to the general public that the reaction is, I don't care. It doesn't have, so we have to figure out how do we express the concepts and ideas and adapt it. So if I'm speaking to you in this particular audience, I will not necessarily speak in the same way as I would speak, like I did, to the Young Farmers of America group in Western Georgia, Northwest Georgia. These are farmers, very conservative farmers. This is the ground, this is the land of Marjorie Taylor, all right? And you have to address it. I was actually a little concerned and say, this is what I'm going to talk about. The person who invited me, are they going to like that? I said, you just go ahead. They loved it because I talked about climate change in the context of agriculture and growing seasons. This is the way it's affecting you. Oh, and they said, yeah, that's true. Tell me more. And that's what we need to do. That we don't know how to do that. And we have to educate ourselves and our students a lot better on how to do that. Otherwise, we cannot convey the issue. We don't have time now, but I make a contrast that I've done over many years between why did the Montreal Protocol was so successful compared to any attempt to control emissions of carbon dioxide and methane and others to control climate change. Because in the Montreal Protocol, I had substitute technologies that people understood, and that was economically advantageous to a few. And equally important, I could turn around and tell to Dara or Brendan, say, if you don't solve this problem, you're going to get skin cancer. And it's not going to be your children. You are going to get skin cancer. And that, oh, wait a second. Let's think of this. But when you look historically and make the analogy, the predictions were the same. When the ozone hole was predicted, it was a theoretical paper. There was no measurements. There was no corroboration. So we have to learn on how to do it.
Fully agree.
Subject area of hydrodynamics and coastal engineering, and he migrated to a nascent topic of hydrology. What is it about his personality, are you able to guess, that would allow him to have the courage to do that?
You want to begin? You're the grandson.
I think I mentioned that towards the end. My conclusion was that his insistence on general intellectualism, that you have to know things outside your particular discipline. And he wanted to see a context for hydrology, and he saw it in systems analysis and geosciences. And he went back to school during that year and was sat in classes to learn about those. So I think it's open to think outside the box rather than just perpetuate the tools that they've given you.
I think he was incredibly focused. Once he set his mind to become a hydrologist, he became one. He drove everything forward. He was very demanding to work for in many ways, persistent, questioning. But I could see him switching his careers. I mean, yes, he recognized that the world was evolving into looking at hydrology. There were a number of other academics doing it, but Pete was by far the strongest, I would say, academically, and with the most drive. So that's what drove him. I mean, yes, 8 a.m. on a Monday morning was typical. I remember a week where we had a number of final exams and we didn't quite meet our research goals for that week. We were working 30 hours or 40 hours a week, whatever it was, as research assistants. He didn't give us any slack at all. No matter what else you have to do, you have to get these research goals done. He was that determined and that focused. But a tough master, but a fantastic person with incredible intellect.
Eric, if I may continue, it's a really good question, trying to identify and isolate what is it about the person's personal traits or capabilities. And he didn't do this once. So it wasn't a sort of a one-off happened in particular set of circumstances. He did it several times. He did it to ecohydrology, hydrologic science, to global hydrology, over and over again. So it is something in the personality and not just chance.
Yeah. Let me say, which I think that's something in the personality, and maybe you guys disagree, but Pete was incredibly competitive. That incredibly competitive, and that's why he liked baseball so much also. Yeah, he was passionate about everything that way. He wanted to compete and he wanted to win. And hence his moves, to some extent, when you look at it, he had a good sense of where the opportunities were. And he was going to make his competitive gene said, I want to make a difference. And he would ask himself, where do I make a difference? Well, I'm going to make a difference where there's so little known, and he knew he had the intellectual ability and capable to make it happen. And if you look at what he did, that drove it. You know, and I think he was incredibly successful at it. And let me end this comment with a joke, because I'm sure that irked him to no avail. I think he had heard that, but yeah, I heard it directly from the horse's mouth. But I don't know. Anybody here knew Jack Kennedy? Jack Kennedy was an extraordinary hydraulician. He actually was a professor here at MIT for a few years. And then he became the director of the Iowa Institute of Hydraulic Research, following Hunter Rouse, another giant of the field. And Jack, who died too darn early, he had an incredible sense of dry humor, not different to Pete, but more proper than Pete, by the way. Some of Pete's joke I cannot tell here. But Jack, one day, I was in Iowa, and he looks, you know, what the problem is, Rafael, is the following. Here's your problem. Hydrology is to hydraulics the same as astrology is to astronomy. Yeah, that hurts. All right. So I am sure that I laughed it off, and he meant it in good way, but I am sure that Pete heard things like that, and probably from Jack himself. They were good friends. And believe me, Pete heard that, he would not just take it. And that, I think, that competitive gene will immediately go into high gear. I'm going to prove you darn wrong. I think that was part of it.
And also, one more thing I should mention, that if you look at just number of publications, Pete probably had less than 20, which in today's academic world would
I had more than that, but it was not.
Yeah, but what's in those is what I mentioned as Talmudic text. You read over and over again and discover a new thing. It's just that the density of those and the quality is very different for him than for other authors I've seen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Is that a question? There's somebody standing in the microphone there. I'm sorry,
Yeah, thank you guys for the presentation and giving a great overview of hydrology and Pete's contributions to the field. My question was, you talk a lot about how Pete was very interdisciplinary in his approach, and just now also went into his competitive personality. Can you give more insight onto his problem-solving process? Earlier, you had also mentioned he was very big on first principles and just overall how he approached problems such as the hydraulic cycle and everything within the fields that he really developed himself.
I think one trait that you see in the at least 3 examples where he was the year 0 of a discipline is that in each case, he did not shy away and was not afraid of going back to, page 1 and reimagining the whole thing, right? And trying to reassemble from historical remnants that are around us.
Well, I would like to say I saw that exactly in 67 and 68. We started from scratch. He was working on his book, but in terms of how to simulate a watershed, we went back to first principles. We did not build on work that had been done before because Pete wanted to understand what are the fundamental underlying principles. If I go back and analyze them in detail, can we develop a better understanding? That was primitive science compared to where he ended up later, but that was generally his whole approach to things was, I need to understand exactly what's going on.
If you look at his 1978 papers, which I think were foundational, and you look at the books, for example, the last 2 books, I would venture to say that there's nothing in there that anybody had written at all like it. In other words, they're blank slate. That was his approach. He just took a canvas, a blank canvas, and he would just start from that. Now, one thing that, I don't know those of you, but Pete, and I think I'm true in this, Pete was a loner, the way I saw him. He worked pretty much by himself. He consulted and talked to a few people, and I'm talking to a few, probably less than a handful, here and there, but he just would go to his office, close the door, sharpen his pencil, and just work by himself. In contrast to many of us that are more of a social scientist in terms of interacting with a lot of people. Pete was not like that. He knew the problem, he knew where he wanted to get to, and he would just sit there and think and think and write until he got to it. And once in a while, he would go to one of us, whoever was closest, and say, hey, can you get this for me? Or what do you think of that? But it was sort of here and there. It wasn't a question of, let's sit down and work this together. That I don't remember that ever happening, not with me.
Not in my time either. I mean, that's why I mentioned Frank Perkins and John Shockey and Ron McLaughlin. Those really were the intermediaries between Pete's loner thinking and process and those of us who actually had to do the work. We needed this support from the intermediaries who could read between the lines and helped us out. But Pete was certainly, I would agree, he was very much a loner, but very determined in what he was doing.
And also, a great sense of humor,
Oh,
a very dark sense of humor. Yes. One of the last conversations I had with him, he had an eye problem, and one eye was completely black eye, and the other one was fine. And the first thing he says is that you should see the other guy.
I can imagine that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.